Well, I have to say that I kind of got excited because I'm preaching from just one verse in the Bible today. And I thought, boy, that's an opportunity to just really preach a short sermon and everybody goes home happy, especially you NASCAR fans. Well, there's a little bit more in this verse than anticipated. And I really do hope to share that with you this morning. We are starting a series of studies called Difference Makers. And we're continuing actually to just study through the book of Matthew and through what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And I've identified 4 topics from Matthew 5 that help us to be difference makers. Well, a difference maker is someone who has trusted their life to the Lord, and God uses them to make a difference in the world. And so we want to explore, how does that happen? What is God's plan for us? Today we're starting in Matthew 5:13 that says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." So we're talking about salt, a very basic commodity. There's more to salt than what, I guess, meets the taste buds. Salt has been used in many, many cultures as a very valuable commodity. Do you realize and understand and know that our word salary comes from the word salt? You've heard it said that a man is worth his salt, right? So those things come from this historic valuing of this very simple commodity to us. If you really think about it, though, salt is a very important chemical process that we need in our system for life. So the Roman soldiers were given their worth in salt, which means they were actually given money for the purpose of buying salt, which was absolutely necessary. In many of the Middle Eastern countries, to take and eat salt together with someone meant that you had pledged a commitment to that other individual. Salt was also and continued to be very valuable in the days of Christ. And so Jesus' point in Matthew 5:13, that you are the salt of the earth, has a little more value to it than just simply adding flavor, or even the quantity or the purpose of salt being a preservative. And so that's what I want us to kind of explore this morning together. The other thing that I want you to understand is salt, no matter what you do to it. If we were to do an experiment, and if we actually had a hot, warm day with sunshine, if you took a glass of water and you mixed salt into it so it all dissolved, but left the glass out in the sun so all the water would evaporate, what's left in the glass? The salt's still there. And even though it had once been diluted, the salt that's left is still salt, and it tastes just the same. Salt is always salt. So I was a little bewildered, I guess, when this verse says salt that loses its saltiness, because salt it's always salt. What I'd like us to do then is to try to understand what really was Jesus saying when he said, "You are the salt of the earth." And then we'll explore for just a moment at the end what it means to lose our saltiness. A number of years ago, there was a musical artist by the name of Bobby Dylan. Anyone hear of him? Did you know that he had a Christian phase in his music? Anyone know that? He did. He wrote a song called "You Gotta Serve Somebody." And I thought about playing it, except for it lasts like 6 or 7 minutes, and then I'd get into NASCAR time and then I'd be in trouble. But the bottom line of his song is that no matter who you are, you have to serve somebody. And his song says, you will either serve the devil or you'll serve God. And those are the two choices in life. You have to serve somebody. Who we serve is very clear by our thoughts, our actions, our behaviors, and the lives that we live. So this is part of the truth that I think we need to explore this morning as we look at salt. Another thing that I'd like to share with you is the idea of being a royal priesthood. A royal priesthood. In 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 9, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." So we are this chosen people, this royal priesthood. As we explore this morning what it means to be the salt of the earth, I need you to keep in mind that as a Christian, you are a royal priesthood. Because we're going to go back to the Old Testament to understand what it means to be the salt of the earth. And as we look at the priest of the Old Testament, as we look to the Old Covenant, and about what it means to be a priest, then we need to understand that those kinds of things that applied to them as priests apply to us as bringing the royal priesthood in the modern era and as Christians. So when we talk about salt and we talk about the covenant, in the Old Testament there was what was called the covenant of salt, or the salt of the covenant. It's said both ways. So in Leviticus chapter 2 at verse 13, this is the first verse in the Bible that talks about salt and covenant. It says, "Every grain offering of yours, moreover, shall be seasoned with salt, so that the salt of the covenant of your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering." And then it says and adds to that, "With all of your offerings you are to add salt." Well, that's an interesting thing. Why is salt being added to the grain offerings, and to all of the offerings, in fact? Part of it would be for flavor. Especially, have you ever eaten a saltless saltine? They have them out there now. They're really rather bland and dry and not real pleasant. So imagine if you're eating the grain offering and it has no salt. So part of it was flavoring. For the meat that they were offering to the Lord, part of it was preservation and for flavor. But not every offering was to be consumed by the Levites, by the priests. So why add salt to all the offerings? It goes on then in Numbers chapter 18, and it says this, "All of the offerings and all of the holy gifts which the sons of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and to your sons and to your daughters with you as a perpetual allotment. It is an everlasting covenant of salt. And it is between you and the Lord and your descendants after you." What this is saying is that when God had designed how the people of God would inhabit the land, he gave each tribe a different piece of the land and said, "This is yours." And when doing so, they had the resources of that land. The cattle and the other animals, the food, all the food that would grow in the crops, all of that belonged to them. But to the people that were called the Levites, he made them to be their priest. And he's saying to the priest that all of the sacrifices that are brought in by all the other tribes, that belongs to you. That is your food. That's your possession. And so the Levites lived on the sacrifices that were made by the people of God, offering them to God, and then the Levites had that benefit. In this particular verse, different than the first verse that we looked at, the order of the words changes from salt of the earth to covenant of salt. And Moses is being instructed to tell the people that we are to be dependent on these sacrifices. Now keep in mind again, we are what? The royal priesthood. We are to be very similar to those Old Testament people. So when it says that God was providing for the priest through these sacrifices and through all of the things that were going on, is he not saying to us as well that he is providing for us? Don't we even learn in the Sermon on the Mount, don't worry about all these things, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and what? all these things shall be added unto you. To trust God. It's about God is building a relationship of trust, a covenant with them. So their allotment, what they were given, was to be what they were inheriting from God. This offering that was given to them was what they were supposed to live on. They had to trust God to take care of them. Well, that sounds a lot like our Christian faith, doesn't it? Are we not, in our walk with the Lord, to trust God to lead us and to guide us and to take care of us and to meet our needs and to direct us in the manner in which we ought to go? God himself was providing for his people. And I would suggest to you that God is still providing for his people. In 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 5 is the last time we see this concept of the covenant of salt in the Old Testament. And it says this, "Do you not know that the Lord God of Israel gave the rule over Israel forever to David and to his sons by a covenant of salt?" So when God had taken the kingdom away from Saul and he had given it over to the Lord, the scriptures here in 2 Chronicles saying God did this through a covenant, through an agreement. That was an agreement of salt. Remember what I had said when I was just talking about salt, that in the Middle East it was very common where two people would eat salt together and it would bind an agreement between them? So this is the kind of thing that's happening where God is agreeing to a covenant with David and his family that forevermore David's family will sit on the throne of Israel. The biggest problem I think we have with understanding the covenant of salt is that there is no place in the Bible where you can read where it just says, this is what the covenant of salt is, and gives a good description of it. So we have to try to understand it. I've already mentioned to you that some have said that salt is to be used as a preservative. So it has that kind of preserving nature to it. We know that if we add salt to meat products, that it can be preserved. The native Indians of America were salting meat to preserve it and hold it over so it would last for them. You may have heard of something called salt cod, where they just pack that fish in salt and then you have to let it soak in water to try to leach out some of the salt just to make it edible. But many of the biblical scholars will point to the fact that all of these verses are simply about God building this kind of preservative nature. That we as Christians, if we are the salt of the earth, we have been left behind to simply be a preserving nature for the world. That God would allow the world to continue to endure. But I think there's much more going on. I'm not saying that there is not a preservative quality to the salt that you and I are to be. We are to help preserve our country and our world. But there's something much more going on. Salt was, again, used to legally bind two people to an agreement. When we think about preserving something, that you take that salt and you rub it into the meat. Jesus' disciples were called upon to go out into the world as salt of the earth, as are we. And God entrusts to our care the message that He's given to us, especially to those that are our loved ones. So the preserving quality is there, but let's explore further and see if we can't find out what's more. Another part of the quality of salt is its cleansing nature. So salt was used as a cleansing agent. The scripture says that you should not eat meat with the blood in it, because the life is in the blood. So salt was oftentimes added to meat because it draws out, it has a way of leaching out the blood so that you could eat it without breaking that command of God. So salt can be preserving. Salt can be an agent of cleansing so that we are faithful to the Lord our God. But the problem with these two things is, again, salt being added to the grain offering and to the meat offerings was not something that affected every offering, but it was added to every offering. So what is it really happening here? As it relates to the priest, David was given a covenant of salt so that his family line would endure forever. So what I think is happening here is that while it preserves and while it cleanses, there's this enduring nature about salt. And it's about a covenant. It's about the relationship that we have with God. And so what I really want us to spend most of our time on this morning is looking at the covenant relationship that we have with God. That God wants to have a relationship with us. God had called upon the Levites, and or we see them as the priest. They would represent the Christian in the New Testament. And that their service should endure for all time. That God wanted these Levites to minister to his people throughout all time. The people in those days were absolutely dependent on salt. Think about living in the Middle East. What's your general impression of what it's like there? A lot of sunshine? A lot of hot weather? What happens to us when we work hard all day and we don't drink water? We don't hydrate. Sunstroke. Even death. And what really is happening in the body is not just a depletion of water, but a deletion of salt or sodium chloride in our body. And our bodies begin to shut down because of it. Salt was an essential commodity for life. And so they would store salt. They would buy salt. It was truly traded. Salt was an extremely important commodity for them in order to sustain life. Yes, they used it to preserve meats. Yes, they used it to cleanse meats of the blood. But they used it because it nurtured their life and it gave them the ability. In order to take salt then, and say, God, I'm going to take some of my salt, which is vital for life, and I'm going to give it to you for the offerings. They were actually to tithe of their salt to the Lord. So you take that essential quantity of life and you say, God, here, you take it. You use it. And you just put it in you just put it in the sacrifices. And you could be thinking, God, why are you doing this? I could use that, but you're telling me to give it to you so you could burn it up in a sacrifice. And it's just gone. Don't we sometimes have questions about why God does things? And really what's happening here is God saying, I want you to know that you have a relationship with me, with a holy God. I want you to know that you can trust me. And if you trust me, if you walk with me, if you are faithful in that relationship, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure that your needs are met. So the word that we see here is the word covenant. And just so you're well aware, the word covenant in the Old Testament, that's the Hebrew word there, is an agreement or an alliance between two parties where each party makes a pledge to keep their end of the bargain. I like to summarize it in 3 simple words. A covenant is about parties, terms, and promises. 2 parties or more, can be more, with terms of agreement, making a pledge to do something, and promises. Promises that if you do this, I will do that. The second word we have here is the word salt. Salt literally means to rub pieces together to pulverize them, to cause to disappear as dust, or to season something and rub it with salt. So salt was used as a way of just grinding away. It's like an abrasive. You know, just a little Pinterest tip for you when you're cleaning your house. If you need a mild abrasive on something, a little salt and water, kind of rub it in, and you're good to go. You didn't expect that on Sunday morning, did you? So God had a covenant relationship. God had a covenant relationship with Noah. Remember when God was working with Noah, God went to him and he said, Noah, here's what I want you to do. Out of all the people that are living today, I see you as one that stands out as holy. I'm calling upon you to build an ark. And if you build that ark, I will preserve you and your family. So over perhaps as many as 120 years, Noah spends his life building an ark in the middle of the desert where there's not even a lot of water around, and he's simply trusting God with his life. Noah, what are you doing? There's not enough water around here anywhere to make that boat float. You're a crazy man. I'm going to tell you right now, in your walk with Jesus, as you trust Him with your life, there's going to be people that are saying, you're a crazy man or woman to do that. It doesn't make sense to give your life and your heart and trust a God in heaven with what you do and what you say and who you are. Until the first raindrop falls. And maybe there's a point here. So God had this covenant relationship with Noah. God also had a covenant relationship with Adam, the Scriptures teach us. He had a covenant relationship with Abraham. And the fact and the reality is, God does not work with anybody in any kind of relationship outside of a covenant relationship. There are always parties involved. One party is God, the other party is man, or you, personally. There are stipulations involved. God says, if you do this, then I will do this. Stipulations, isn't that contrary to grace? No, it's not, in fact. Because what God did for us is something He accomplished whether we would have ever responded or not. It was before we were obedient. It was while we were still sinners that Christ died on the cross. The act of grace is there and available to everybody, but God does say we have to respond to that grace. God does say that we have to be in a covenant relationship with Him. And so for the people of the Old Testament, there were different things they had to do versus the things that God calls us to do, but it is a covenant relationship. The very first place in the Bible that actually uses the word salt is in reference to the wife of Lot. Remember the story, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, an evil society. You might as well say it was 2019 in America. And God told Lot that the city would not be destroyed until you and your family are removed. But don't look back. The covenant, the Bible does not use the word covenant here, but there was a covenant going on. God had shared with Lot the terms of the covenant. You leave and don't look back, and I will save you and your family. But what happened to Mrs. Lot? What happens to some of us? That draw to the world, that draw to what is home and familiar and comfortable. Sometimes when we get into our relationship with God and our covenant with Him, we want to look back. We should become a pillar of salt, the Scriptures teach. Yes, they were dependent on salt, but they were to trust God to take care of them, to give them what they needed. The priests were to trust God with meeting their needs, that God would provide for their livelihood. David was to trust God that on the throne of Israel, his descendants would sit. And ultimately we know, because we can look back, that Jesus sat on that throne. In Exodus chapter 30 and verse 34, it uses the word salt in the process of making the temple incense. Now the temple incense was a fragrance, a combination of chemicals, and it always included salt. And if we're in the holy place, where the lampstand would be and the table of showbread, the altar of incense would be right here in front of the veil. And on the other side of the veil was the mercy seat, the throne of God. God actually dwelled in that place while He lived among the people of Israel. If you were to go in through the veil, you would die. Because it was a holy place. It was where God lived. And on this altar of incense, they would go to the altar of sacrifice, which would be outside, the one where they sacrificed all the animals. And they would take a burning coal from that altar, and they would place it on the altar of incense. And then they would spread the incense over it. And the incense would begin to smolder. And they were learning about communicating with God, of presenting their requests before God, knowing that He would respond to them. And so the smoke, the fragrance on the altar would go through the veil, so God could hear their prayers, is what that represented. The interesting thing to note is the altar of sacrifice, which was outside, was always covered with animals that were sacrificed, seasoned with salt. So the burning coals would have salt on them. Remember, salt's always salt. And they take that burning coal with salt on it, and they place it here. And they take the incense, which had salt mixed into it, and they place it over the coal. And God is getting this aroma, this seasoned with salt, this idea of endurance, this idea of trusting God with something very important. It would be much like us saying, God, I trust you with all of my finances, with all of my possessions. I just trust you. And I'm willing to give back to you. In Revelation chapter 8, verse 3, the same imagery of this altar of incense. And to think about that, the coals having salt upon them and the incense and this communication between us and God. So when we take these two different words, covenant and salt, and we put them together, we're talking about an agreement between us and God. And this product or of salt that gives us truth, that gives us life. So a covenant of life, a relationship of true eternal life is what's being said here. The covenant of salt is completely and totally about the question I asked when I mentioned Bobby Dylan. Who are you going to serve? A covenant of relationship with God or yourself? So when we come now to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, when we talk about being the salt of the earth, what is Jesus saying here? The immediate context, the verses right before this, all talk about blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake. And it talks about hardship and persecution and difficulties. That you will be blessed if you're persecuted, and then go be the salt. Remember that. So what it's saying is, in that persecution, you've got to keep true to that covenant relationship. We need to understand that God is going to provide. I have to trust God even in persecution, even in trials and tribulation in this world. In the Gospel of Luke, in verse 14, verse 34 and 35, it says this: Therefore salt is good, but even if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is simply thrown out. Well, what's the context where Luke 14 talks about salt being useless? It is in this passage that Jesus tells his disciples to count the cost of following him. To count the cost of what it means to follow Jesus. What he says is, you must love me more than you love your own family. You must love me more than you love your own life. He says to them, if you go out to build a tower, would you not consider how much it costs to build the tower before starting the project? So you could finish it? He says if you're going to go to war, wouldn't you want a good idea of how many soldiers they have versus how many soldiers you have, so that when you go to war you come away a victor and not dead? Count the cost. When you started your life with Jesus, did you count the cost? To count the cost, to say, I want to give my life to Christ. I really want to surrender. I want to be the sacrifice. Because if I start the walk and I walk away, what does it say? Salt has no value. It is worthless and needs to be just thrown away. It's not about starting a walk with Jesus. It's continuing a walk and preserving to the very end. Oh, there's that word preserving. The commodity of salt. In Mark chapter 9 and verse 49 it says this, "For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." In the context of this verse then, Jesus is saying that it is horrible for us to cause somebody else to stumble and fall. In fact, it talks about that we would do something that would make the little ones fall away from Jesus. That the lives that we live, and I would say as parents, as teachers, ought to be so crucial that we understand that little children can be driven away by the way that we live our own lives. He actually says in this verse, and you've heard it stated, I'm sure, if your eye causes you to be offended, pluck it out. Or if your foot leads you into evil, cut it off. In this verse, Jesus changed the subject matter from just anyone to you personally. But will you be so serious about your life that you give honor to the Lord? That your life matters? That you're not driving people? It's really, it's all about the life that we're living, that it's authentic, that it's real, that God is changing who we are. And it is so amazing that He takes care of us. He says here that everyone will be salted with fire. I think that's amazing. Remember, blessed are those who are persecuted, salted with fire. We're going to go through trials. We're going to have hard times. But God says He's faithful. Do you trust Him? In that relationship, do you trust Him to take you through whatever it is? And I can tell you, as I look at this around this room, I know that there's struggles in so many lives. And they're different. And they're not easy for anyone. But I also know that there's a God that's standing behind you that will be faithful to you because He has a covenant with you to take you to the very end. He has a covenant with you that He has prepared a place for us in heaven where all of our problems are solved. Amen. This life is not the end. Let's take our focus off of all of these other things and realize the one who we've given our life to. Let's give Him the salt of our lives so that we say, God, I trust you with my life. That's going to change who I am. And in being changed in who I am will make me to be the salt of the earth. I appreciate Jackson sharing with us this morning from Colossians 4. Where it says, let your conversation always be full of grace and seasoned with salt so that you know how to give an answer to everyone. Seasoned with salt. Seasoned with what? Seasoned with your relationship with God. Seasoned with His love. Seasoned, yes, with persevering. Seasoned, yes, with the cleansing agents. But seasoned with the covenant of life that you have with Him. In this context, Jesus is talking about sharing the gospel. Paul told the Colossians to be wise in how they acted, how they treated other people so that they would be seen as being the salt of the earth. So how does this happen? In Romans chapter 12, in verses 1 and 2, it says this, therefore I urge you, my brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice. What were all sacrifices rubbed with? Salt. Truth. The enduring quality of a relationship with God. That trust that we have in Him. Because your body being a sacrifice to God, salted, is acceptable to Him. He goes on and says, it is your spiritual service of worship. That your sacrifice, your worship to God is spiritual. It's as though we're on the altar of incense and we've been salted by the coal, we've been salted by the incense, and our plea is being made known to a holy God on the other side. Only today there is no other side, because the Scriptures teach us that as he died upon the cross, the veil between us and God had been torn asunder. And we had access to a holy God. Then it goes on, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is. You being the salt of the earth literally means this, that you are the evidence of a life changed by God. And in so being, you are the evidence that there is a living God who offers a living hope to a dying world. So as we offer our bodies as sacrifices to God, as we have the salt applied to our lives, we know that we are dying to ourselves and we are living to God. We trust in God's holy word as the basis of our covenant relationship, transformed by the renewing of our mind. All right, that's what it means to be the salt of the earth, that we just be in a relationship with God, that God, people see Christ in us. So how do I lose my saltiness? If salt is salt, and what God is, and the things in Christ are always going to be the same, how do I lose my flavor? How do I become more tasteless? Well, it's the same way. If you take, again, let's go back to an experiment. If you take a small glass of water, 8 ounces of water, and you mix a teaspoon of salt in it, I pretty much can guarantee you're not going to drink the whole thing. You're certainly not going to. I mean, you might be able to chug it and try to avoid the taste, but you're not going to sit there and sip on that throughout the day, because it is unpleasant. But if you take that same teaspoon of salt and you mix it into 10 gallons of water, it is very subtle and you can barely taste it. Why? Salt is salt. It's diluted. The salt in the days of Jesus was oftentimes diluted. It was either mixed with water, or if you got your salt from the Dead Sea, and which many of them did, and the water would evaporate along the shore, they would gather up the salt. It was mixed with all kinds of impurities. You know, you've seen rivers and bodies of water with stagnation and mold and bugs. So imagine going up and gathering that white powder with all that stuff and just sprinkling it on your burger tonight. Not real pleasant. It was diluted. So some of that salt was useless. It was spread on roads and things. Well, why would they do that? Why would they spread salt on roads? Because the salt still had a good quality to it. Basically, it was good weed killer. Kept the paths clear so that they could walk. Christians are the salt of the earth, inasmuch as we are living our life by faith in a covenant relationship with our God. But your life can be diluted by giving your life to too much of worldliness. We are to be in the world, but not of the world. God is calling us to live differently. He's not calling us to tolerate sin or to tolerate the things that he says are not appropriate for his people. He wants us to be a holy people, a people fully devoted to him. In the Old Testament, you hate to read the book of Leviticus, but it was all about making his people pure. And all through there, you can read where it says, purge the sin from among you. Purge the sin from among you. As the priests of God, we stand before the world as representatives of who God is. What kind of God are they seeing in us? This idea of losing flavor, you're going to love this, and please don't miss it. Please don't go and abuse this with one another. That this diluted form of salt in the original language talks about losing its flavor, comes from the Greek term where we get our English word moron. Fool. But remember what the Bible says just a few verses down the road. Call no man what? Fool. Call no man a fool. Call no man a moron. Call no man someone that has lost their saltiness. If we look too much like the world, basically we're ineffective. We've lost our saltiness. It's so dangerously easy for us to go down that path of diluting what God has made in us. And worthless salt is not worth nothing more than to cast upon a roadway, into the trash, or upon a manure pile. Jesus is saying to us, you must be the salt of the earth through your relationship with me. We are to behave like pure, white, unadulterated salt. In a worried world which we live in, we must offer the reassurance of who Jesus Christ is. In a depressed world, we must bring the joy of what it means to know Jesus. And in a frightened world looking for answers, we are the people who offer hope of a living Christ who's made a way for them. So we are to be salt. I pray that God would make us such. If you would, we're going to sing together 692, God will take care of you. Let's stand as we sing. If you have a decision to make for Jesus, we invite you to come and make that decision known to us.